Live from the studio, I'm Jimmy Selesky. I was scrolling through Twitter today, doing my research, and I came across a particular tweet that really stuck out to me. And instead of doing what I usually do, which is try to tweet out the perfect opinion in 280 characters or less, or whatever it is now, I would instead direct my energy towards recording a video with my thoughts on the topic, since that is, of course, what we do here on this channel, which, by the way, new content every Monday through Friday. Please do subscribe if you like this content. And if you don't like this content, I cannot recommend enough that you do not subscribe. Maybe even go so far as to leave a really shitty comment. I love those. But this particular tweet has to do with abortion. Now, before we get into this tweet, I'd like to preface it by saying this video is not going to be a staunchly pro-life or pro-choice argument. It is instead an observation on the inherent flaw of the debate itself. Now, this is from Dr. Ron Paul. I think it's a book he wrote or something like that. Let's pull it up. The chapter name is aptly named Abortion. And he writes, on one occasion in the 1960s, when abortion was still illegal, I witnessed, while visiting a surgical suite as an OB/GYN resident, the abortion of a fetus that weighed approximately 2 pounds. It was placed in a bucket, crying and struggling to breathe, and the medical personnel pretended not to notice. Soon the crying stopped. This harrowing event forced me to think more seriously about this important issue. That same day in the OB suite, an early delivery occurred, and the infant born was only slightly larger than the one that was just aborted. But in this room, everybody did everything conceivable to save this child's life. My conclusion that day was that we were overstepping the bounds of morality by picking and choosing who should live and who should die. These were human lives. There was no consistent moral basis to the value of life under these circumstances. Some people believe that being pro-choice is being on the side of freedom. I have never understood how an act of violence, killing a human being, albeit a small one in a special place, is portrayed as a precious right. Now, there's a reason I wanted to take a look at that. Because, again, in my opinion, that passage very concisely frames up the entire issue with the debate itself. It seems to me that each side is arguing a completely different point. You're having two separate conversations, and neither one of them is particularly intellectually honest, in my opinion. The pro-life side argues that life begins at conception. I tend to agree with that. I can't think of any other definition of life that is purely scientific. It would seem to me that upon fertilization of the egg, that the process of life has begun. Given the proper circumstances, in much the same way as given the proper circumstances in your day-to-day, you will continue to exist. In much the same way, assuming everything goes as planned, that fertilized egg is developing into a human life. There's no chance that you're going to give birth to a tree or an action figure or a goat. It will be a human life from that moment. So throughout the debate over the years, we've kind of put into place certain what I would consider to be arbitrary definitions of the beginning of life. Probably the most popular being the heartbeat. Once the fetus has a detectable heartbeat, it can be considered a life. But even this is an arbitrary decision. It's an arbitrary moral decision made by people trying to find some way to justify an abortion at some point. This, of course, is not the scientific definition of a life. The scientific definition of a life would be at conception. And again, I would find you hard-pressed to argue any other point at which you could classify previous to it, it was not alive, and upon it, it is now alive, unless your argument is purely moral. Now, that debate centering around at which point it becomes a life is inherently the pro-life side of the conversation. The pro-choice conversation, you will find, centers almost entirely around a completely different question altogether, and that is the question of human rights, or more so women's rights, particularly women's rights. The question on the pro-choice side is, should anyone be allowed to dictate a decision that a woman makes with her body? Now, of course, the inherent flaw in that is that if you classify a living fetus, a baby in utero, as a human life, then the conversation or the question is not as simple as a woman's right to choose what to do with her body, because by definition, there is another body in question, that being the baby. So that point, I find, on the pro-choice side of things, is just conveniently ignored. We focus on the question of a woman's right to choose, and in an effort to not cloud that, fairly, without the existing of a human life that is also involved outside of the woman who is pregnant, the question of whether or not a woman should be allowed to choose to get an abortion is very simple. It's a very simple question. And if that were legitimately the question, I can't think of too many people that would argue that a woman shouldn't be able to get an abortion. I don't think there's that many people on planet Earth that are against abortion strictly because they just hate the idea of a woman being able to make a decision for herself. Now, of course, this is how it's painted. And this is what many people on that side of things believe is the hang-up, when in reality, the hang-up is, again, we're having two separate conversations. So that's the intellectual dishonesty on the pro-choice side of things. Let's take a look at the intellectual dishonesty on the pro-life side. If you ask most pro-life people, they will argue, in the most extreme cases, what I just stated at the beginning, which is that life begins at conception. However, most pro-lifers, people that consider themselves pro-life, are willing to have a certain timeline at which point they would deem an abortion acceptable. Even those who classify abortion as murder would still even be willing to concede in most cases that in circumstances of rape or incest, that an abortion is justifiable. How? If abortion is murder, if life begins at conception, how is an abortion in the case of rape or incest morally justifiable? The cliche being, can you abort a 2-year-old who is born a product of rape or incest? No. You can't kill something that's been born, but for some reason, you can kill something that hasn't been born yet in certain cases. Well, that to me says that you don't actually view a fetus entirely as a human life. If you did, then you would feel the same way about aborting a 6-week-old fetus in the case of rape or incest as you would about killing a 6-year-old child who was a product of rape or incest. That sounds ridiculous. Why does it sound ridiculous? Because you don't actually believe what you're saying. If you did believe what you were saying, you wouldn't find that ridiculous. You know, you had guys saying, look, obviously I'd like for abortion to be illegal altogether, but, you know, this is politics. This is the country we live in. So, like, you know, we have to accept in certain cases that, like, certain laws aren't going to allow for that, but instead they're going to have to be like compromises and things like that. And all I could think was, would you be talking like that if this is a question of killing toddlers or infants? Would you be sitting there and be like, look, I'd prefer if people weren't going around scrambling up 2-year-old kids. But this is a democracy, a country where we have to make compromises. It's a slow walk to the end goal. And so we have to be willing to bend. No, you wouldn't. You'd say, dude, I'm not going to compromise on that. I'm not going to allow in any circumstances that you scramble up infants and toddlers and small children. I'm not going to make a rule that says, okay, if they're less than 2 years old, you can do it. But after that, it's going to be a problem. No compromises. There are no compromises in that conversation. Yet, there seems to be some compromise in the abortion conversation. So that in and of itself is also intellectually dishonest. So you have two entirely different conversations being had in which both sides are not only talking past each other, but they're talking past themselves. They're both ignoring the key elephant in the room, the wrench in the cogs of both of their debates. The pro-choicers are ignoring the fact that it is a life on some level. And the pro-lifers are ignoring the fact that even they believe it's a life, but not quite as much of a life as like your life or my life or people who have been born. So how can you possibly have this conversation? Going back to this tweet, I remember being at a bar a couple years ago, and a good friend of mine, his wife, or girlfriend at the time, was pregnant. And I remember saying something along, and I think they were like 3-4 months pregnant at the time. She was. I hate when people say we're pregnant or they are pregnant. She was pregnant. She was 3-4 months along at the time. And I remember saying something like, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just kind of observing the possibilities. I was like, well, you know, if everything goes through, there's a chance it couldn't, right? Or blah, blah, blah. And I remember one of my other friends, a girl who is very pro-abortion, said, Jimmy, you can't say that. Why would you say that? And I remember thinking, wow, I just acknowledged a possibility that a 3 to 4 month fetus may not come to term, may not be born, something may go wrong, it may not live. And she found that very offensive. Yet, in the same context, or shall I say, in a different context, if someone was to abort a fetus at 3 months, aka the first trimester, which many people settle upon, she would not in any way consider that ending a life. So it became apparent to me that basically a fetus becomes a life when you decide it does. And that's exactly what Ron Paul's talking about in here. In one instance, they abort an unborn baby. They take it out of the womb. They throw it in a bucket. It's crying. They leave it there to die. It eventually does die. And they move about it like nothing happened. In another instance, a baby, in his own words, not much further along and not much larger than the baby they just threw in a bucket to die, was born prematurely, and they did everything in their power to save it. What made one baby worth saving and one baby worth killing? Your decision. That's the problem. That's the actual problem. We are at a place in the abortion debate where even the people that are staunchly pro-life still allow for some wiggle room in terms of it actually being a life. And that wiggle room always comes down to how you feel about it. The baby doesn't know he was a product of rape. The baby doesn't know he was a product of incest. The baby doesn't know that the mother just decided she doesn't want to, give birth to the child. And the baby doesn't know that it's alive or not alive, depending on how the people in the room feel about it. But that is the case. That is actually the case. Now, the bigger problem here is I don't have a better solution. I don't. I know many of you guys came to this channel with 370-something subscribers and thought, this guy probably has the answer to one of the largest ongoing debates in Western society. And unfortunately, you would be wrong. I don't have the answer. I have the question, though. I remember speaking to another friend of mine who actually got very popular on TikTok a few years back for posting short little clips of him debating abortion with people online. Now, to give him his credit, he was someone who didn't even believe in abortion in the case of rape and incest. And although I don't even necessarily agree with that take, I at least respect it as the only legitimate take if you are a true pro-lifer. But I asked him a question, a hypothetical that I came across. And the hypothetical was, and it's a cliche sounding, stupid would you rather, basically, that sounds like a bad argument simply because of the simplicity or unrealisticness of it. The hypothetical question was, if you were in a hospital that caught on fire, and in one room you had a small toddler, 2 years old, 3 years old, whatever, and in the other room you had 100 fetuses incubating at various stages of the process. But to make this hypothetical even more interesting, let's say it's all 1, 2, 3 months along. Not even really recognizable as human beings yet. Just fetuses in gestation. And you could only save one of those rooms. Would you save the 2-year-old, or would you save the room of 100 fetuses? And the answer most people will give you, if they're really being honest, is they would save the 2-year-old. They would save the kid before they'd save the unborn fetuses. Now I'm going to get into why that matters, why it's not a silly hypothetical. The easiest thing to say in response to that is, well, you know, the 2-year-old's conscious and it can feel pain. So a 2-year-old burning alive and dying is a much more miserable death than the 100 unborn fetuses who would not be conscious of their death. I think maybe not. I imagine they can feel pain. I don't know. We just wouldn't look at it the same. And that's a fair point. That is a fair point. But I don't think it necessarily helps one way or the other, because I think even if we were to somehow create a situation where the 2-year-old wouldn't feel pain or wouldn't be aware of his death, maybe that 2-year-old was in a coma or something like that, people would still opt to save the 2-year-old. So removing the pain part aside, the question still stands and the answer still stands for most people. You would still save the 2-year-old, even in a perfect scenario where neither one of them would die a miserable death. the child or the fetuses. So when you ask a person that, and they inevitably give you that answer, if they're being honest, you have then proven a point. And the point is that everyone on an inherently intuitive level sees the death of a child as a far more significant loss than the death of an unborn fetus. We talk about a child dying of some type of sickness or getting hit by a car or something like that as a much more traumatic thing than, say, having a miscarriage. It's accurate. It's true. So we all intuitively acknowledge that even if we believe fetuses are human lives, they're not quite of the same value. Now, here's my thoughts on that. You could raise that same question in a different way. Let's say in this scenario, you have a 2-year-old child in a room, and in the other room, you have an 80-year-old adult. And you can only save one in this burning building. Who do you save? Well, of course, I think pretty much every person would say, you save the child. Now, does that mean that you don't see the 80-year-old person as a life? You can argue if you want that the fetuses aren't a life yet or at all. But you certainly can't argue that the 80-year-old is a life. Yet, you still find it incredibly easy to decide to save the child before the elderly person. Pretty much more than anyone, a 40-year-old, whatever. So we value the lives of children above the value of adults, of course. And yet, at no point are we proving the non-existence or non-life of the other person, the adult. So we have established that we believe that a 2-year-old's life is more valuable, that we care more about it than the elderly person or the fetuses, but we have not obviously established that therefore the elderly person is not alive, and we also have not necessarily established that the fetuses are not alive. We've merely established that they're not as important. So now we find ourselves at somewhat of a logical speed bump, or more like a logical brick wall. Because when you take the question to its extreme, you've exposed that no one really believes entirely what they say they do. Now, going back to the pro-choice side of things, that hypocrisy is much easier to expose, in my opinion, because there doesn't really actually seem to be any moral justification at all based in reality. Meaning, their solution to get over the logical brick wall of it being a life is to pretend it's not, to just say it's not. It's just not. How can we prove that scientifically? We can't. Trust the science, but not in this case. Definitely do not trust the science in the case of pregnancy. It's not a life because we just said it's not a life. Okay, what are you going to do? Argue with that? The pro-choice side of things is we said so. Because we said so. Because it's much easier to argue from the angle that it's a woman's rights decision. So we've exposed the pro-life side of things by showing that for most of them, their argument has limits. You find in a lot of cases, this isn't necessarily an example of hypocrisy, but rather an example of cognitive dissonance. I saw someone share a post or a meme or something like that a while back that said making abortion illegal is not going to stop people from getting abortions. It's just going to stop them from having safe access to one. And that is true. But what I find ironic about that is I think most people would agree, and this, of course, does not go for everyone, but I think most people would agree that, generally speaking, the people who advocate pro-choice opinions, pro-abortion, tend to be highly correlated with the people who advocate kind of anti-gun or gun control sentiments. Again, I understand there's people that are pro-choice and pro-gun. I understand there's people that are pro-life and anti-gun. But if somebody put a gun to our head and we weren't in a position to pretend to think something just to shoot my point down, but instead your life depended on it, and they said, this person is constantly posting all day about pro-choice and women's rights and the right to choose and abortion and blah, 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 blah. What do you think their stance on guns is? I really can't say. I would have no insight. You know what you'd say. They're probably anti-gun. Okay? Congratulations. Odds are you live another day. Okay? So let's cut the crap. That seems to be the case for most people. And what a lot of pro-gun people like to say is also true, which is making guns illegal is not going to stop people from getting guns. It's just going to stop the law-abiding people from getting guns, and the criminals are going to do what criminals do, which is commit crime, in which case gun ownership would be one of those crimes. So I remember commenting on that post that they shared about making abortion illegal, not actually stopping abortion, just filling in the blanks for guns instead of abortion. And even they said, touche, so to speak. But I don't think it mattered. I don't think it mattered that they had to acknowledge the truth in that, because what it really is a cognitive dissonance. And so these arguments are waged as a matter of convenience, not really as a matter of truth. This line of thinking is true when it helps your argument, and then when it doesn't help your argument, we ignore it. That's called cognitive dissonance. And likewise, the same people that would use that argument for guns may, without even knowing it, be making the exact argument when it comes to abortion. So that level of cognitive dissonance goes both ways. So naturally, the debate is cloudy. And there's no way for it ever to not be cloudy. But there's certainly a way to clear it up just enough to see a potential path forward. And that all starts with actually taking the time to think about it, reevaluate your opinion, and then the much harder thing, not saying that actually honing your own real true opinion with your own thoughts and logical process is not hard. That's incredibly hard, and most people don't even do that, much less do that for the other side. But only when you've done that do you actually have an opinion. Otherwise, you just have a belief. So once again, as we find ourselves in a place that we often find ourselves on this show, which is, who fucking knows? Who fucking knows? But that's pretty much where we all are all the time. Every day. Nobody knows why we're here. Nobody knows what we're doing. And the closest we're ever going to get is just understanding that that's the case for all of us. Till next time, folks, I'm Jimmy Selesky. You're watching live from the studio. Please hit us with a subscribe, leave us a like, leave us a dislike, leave us a comment, or don't. Peace.